Hi everyone, welcome back to the Falcon Den for a video I'm calling Just the Hip. It's a mobility video that focuses on the hip. I'm doing a bit of a kitchen sink variation, which is that I'm throwing a bunch of things into this one video. I'm not doing it in a way that you can do it along with me, so your job is to try different approaches and see what works for you. A good way to do this is to test the position or the feeling you get in a position before you try one of the stretches or movements or whatever, and then try it again afterwards, especially if you can do one side and test. Like, let's say you're having tight hip feeling in your squat, you might try some squats, do the intervention that you want to try on one side, try your squat again, maybe that side feels better than the other side, maybe it doesn't, and by that means of test and retest, you can kind of hone in on the interventions or the exercises that do the best for you. So there's going to be a lot of things in this video. Try them out. Maybe you just intuitively know which ones are going to feel good to you and which ones won't, and you'll gravitate to things that will work for you. However, try not to avoid the things that you don't want to do just because you probably don't think you would like them. Those are probably the things you should try. My basic formula for mobility is a three-pronged approach: warm, smash, stretch. So we want to get the muscles and tissues, we're going to focus on warm first, then we want to do some smashing, direct pressure directly at the places that feel stuck, and then finally we want to lengthen those muscles, and we want to do so with some activity. I wanted to briefly touch on the difference between warm-up and stretching. So we can use things that look a lot like stretches for our warm-up and things that look a lot like warm-ups for our stretches. For the warm-up, we're not thinking about getting to maximum length, we're just thinking about repetitions of movement, even though something might be used as a stretch later. We're thinking just about getting in and out of that sort of stretch zone gently, but repeatedly in a warm-up. Whereas with stretching, we're thinking about sort of pushing that edge a little bit more. We might hang out in those stretches a little bit more, but we're still going to try to be active. At least that's how I teach it, versus hanging in a stretch for a long time. So warm, smash, stretch. The goal would be to do like 10 minutes of this sort of thing a day. Maybe you can only manage 3 days a week of 10 minutes, but that's going to be a lot better than trying to do an hour of this at a time. Your tissues are going to get irritated and you're going to have diminishing returns. So 10 minutes a day is way better than an hour. So I wanted to start with something kind of before the warm-up section and just thinking about our hips. So we have flexion, which is the hip going this way. We have extension, which is the hip going this way. But then we also have external rotation, which is when the hip goes this way. So if you look at from the front of your thigh and those tissues are moving out, that's external rotation. If those tissues are moving in, that's internal rotation. So we're going to sort of touch on all of those aspects of the hip. The hip is a real focal point for our movement of the lower body. Dysfunction in other areas of the body can find their way into the hip. Similarly, dysfunction in the hip can find its way into all the different parts of the body very easily. So it is a really good place to focus, and a lot of different tissues affect the hip. So before we get to our warm-up, I want to give you just two things to think about for that rotational aspect, which is something we often miss. So you've probably all done something like pigeon before. In this position, we're really getting into the external rotation of the hip. That's great. I would encourage you, if you are familiar with pigeon, to sort of hunt around a little bit. Try not to just hang out there and suffer, but rather move around a little bit, take deep breaths, really trying to fill your abdomen, breathing into the hips in these different positions, trying to keep your back neutral throughout, and use those varieties of pigeon to get that external rotation in the hip. Internal rotation in the hip can be done a few different ways. Gently as sort of a pre-warm-up or warm-up or stretch. You can do this sort of windshield wiper. So as I allow this leg to fall across the center line, I'm internally rotating some of these structures that go across the hip. I can take that further by crossing here and doing some stretch. I can do some breathing. I can do some activation of my core to try to get my low back and pelvis a little bit neutral. So this is automatically trying to push me into an extended low back position. So I might try to fight that with some breathing to kind of claim that internally rotated hip while maintaining a neutral spine. But just sort of hanging out and doing some of these gentle windshield wipers hips are going to move side to side a little bit, and you can make this feel like a gentle movement, just getting closer to a stretch zone for a warm-up, or pushing a little bit further into the stretch as a cool down or stretch kind of thing. All right, stick around for a lot more on just the hip. We're going to start with warming up the different sides of the hip. We have the front of the hip, all these different hip structures in the sides and back of the hip, and then we have the hamstrings in the back that can also contribute to hip tightness. We're going to start with some simple swings. You've probably seen these before if you've watched my videos. Through all of these, we want to focus on movement of the hip and not have our low back crunching forward and back to approximate hip movement. We want to really focus on movement of the hips. So that's going to mean front of the body is going to get on. So a deep breath in, exhaling to squeeze this really tight. You can feel like you're tucking the ribs, tucking the pelvis a little bit. We're just going to try to hold that a little bit. First one is a swing here. We're really trying to warm up through the front of the hip to begin with. So the important part of this is that that toe is going to stay forward. Again, I'm not going to show as much of these as I would want you to do. I'm just going to sort of give you an overview of all the different options, kitchen sink style. And then you probably want to do each of these warm-ups for maybe 30 seconds to a minute, or you choose the ones that work best for you. But again, on this one, toe pointed in, we're trying to capture this tight front of the hip in that backswing. Any rotation out is sort of moving that off tension. So keeping that turned in is more important than range of motion of that leg back. Front of the body here is also important, as we're not trying to dump the pelvis forward repeatedly. So a few on one side, same thing on the other side. Just trying to gently lengthen there. We can take that to the posterior by doing a little bit more in the front. Still trying to be really controlled with that backswing, because we don't really want to get to this position. That's not the goal. It's to get just to wherever that stretch turns on just a little bit. Yanking on the structures of the hip is a really good way to make your back not feel good. It's also a good way to tighten those up. So we're not trying to do that. We're trying to just gently lengthen those tissues to get them prepared for some other stuff. So again, further forward in the front, again, fairly gently, is going to lengthen these hip hamstring as well. Same thing other side. And I'm going to get a little bit warm while I'm doing this, but again, do as much of this as feels good to you, either before your workout or before you do smashing and stretching. A second swing is just going to be across the front, taking that leg wide and then crossing the midline. This one, I wouldn't worry too much about it in terms of stability. You still want to be nice and still through the core, but it doesn't really matter which direction the toe points. We're just trying to get those inner outer thigh and hip structures firing and lengthened a little bit. Same thing, some on one side, some on the other. So forward back swings, cross body swings. Another good one that you've probably seen before is butt kickers. This time we're keeping the knee, hip, and shoulder more or less in a line. We're just bringing the heel back to the hip. That's going to lengthen these thigh muscles, quads, lengthen the hip flexor. The big rectus femoris that crosses the hip goes all the way down the thigh and then also crosses the knee is what we're after here. So letting ourselves bend at the hip is going to sort of turn that off stretch. But if we're here, we're extending through that, and then we're using that movement of the lower leg to lengthen that muscle. So again, a little bit of tension through the front. Make this feel relatively easy. Getting at the front, we can also do some good mornings, lengthening the hamstrings, glutes, and back muscles a bit. Similar idea, but we're just trying to isolate the movement in the hip, going just into a stretch and then coming out of it. Another really great warm-up for some of the structures that contribute to the hip. Low lunge, low is relative. The goal here is that we're trying to keep our pelvis and low back neutral and get the hip extended. So this would be hip flexion, this would be hip extension. In the low lunge, when we're here, our hip isn't all that extended because we're still in a pretty straight line here. But pressing that hip forward and levering our core back really puts this on extension. So you can be lower, and you can press into that tension by lowering the hip and pressing forward. You could also be knee down and think about just tucking that tailbone under. And again, we're not really trying to stretch a whole lot here. We're just trying to get into some lengthening of those tissues. I really like this one, where I'm dropping the hips, using the weight of the body, and then coming out of it. And again, you could do that in relative fashion, depending on where you're at. Trying to keep this on, tucking the tailbone under. And again, you could do some on one side, and then some on the other. You might also just hang around and sort of noodle about. We're getting flexion on the one side, extension on the other. And again, you can also do this from a knee down position, trying to press the hip forward while keeping this on, tucking the tailbone under that direction. Again, just lengthening here. So low lunge, some side to side glides. I like a nice wide stance, setting the hips back, pressing the knees out to start, and then just gliding side to side, getting into some of the hip socket stuff here. So these warm-ups are good to use before you stretch and smash, or smash and stretch in that order. But if you know that you're having hip issues during exercises, you might pick a few of these that feel particularly useful and spend some extra time on them before your workout. Widening as you go. Deeper, the lower you go, the wider you have to go, so that you don't end up in a position where you're sort of falling over that foot. You want that foot to be well up there, so you're always within, your center of gravity is always well between your feet. All right, so glides side to side. Another one that I really like is this, just little hip circles here. So I would go feet about hip distance, and we're just doing little circles here. The idea is that as you push forward, the head of the femur is sort of working its way around the inside of your hip socket. So we have muscles that cause action across the hip. We have fascia, which sort of holds everything together. And then we have the hip socket or joint capsule, the joint capsule that is like a big cartilage socket and sort of housing for all that action. And that cartilage can actually restrict movement at the hip as well. So doing some easy movement of the joint, where you're sort of taking the joint through full range of motion in all these different ways, can also really relieve some tension on that joint. So these circles, again, we're trying to keep the movement at the hip socket. So this rather than this. You can see one of them, my entire tailbone to the top of my head is one unit, forcing the movement to happen just at the hip, and the other I'm allowing my low back to really move around a lot. Still getting some movement at the hip, but not quite as focused. Bow-legged steps is what I'm calling this one. You can do these with one of those little mini bands. You'd call it a monster walk in that case, and you could do these forward back. But the key thing here is we want to press the knees out enough that big toe and little toe are evenly sharing the weight. Heel is also sharing the weight. And then as we step sideways, we're landing right in the middle of our foot and back. Stepping sideways, so the knee really has to stay out over the edge of the foot, versus allowing the knee to be in, big toe takes all the weight, and then you catch up by pressing that out. Still gonna do some warm up for your hip, but we'd rather really think about leading with the knee, stepping into that bow-legged position, and then coming back. Doesn't really matter how far you go. In fact, if you go too far and it's further than your muscles and range of motion can keep up with, you automatically end up in this sort of collapsed arch position, which we're trying to avoid for a number of reasons. So better than that is staying in that balanced position, big toe, little toe, and taking smaller steps while really activating those smaller glute muscles that do this work. Transitioning from that bent over position to a more upright position or a deeper squat position will challenge that in different ways. Taking that forward a little bit and back a little bit will also challenge those muscles, as long as you're not turning that into this. So wherever we're taking those feet, wider, narrower, a little bit forward, a little bit backward, we still want to keep the weight balance, big toe, little toe, heel, to make it super effective and transition us into better movement overall. Finally, Bulgarian butt clenchers is what I'm calling this one. So Bulgarian split squat is when we get this back leg up on something and we do a full like lunge kind of thing, really focusing the work here. Here, all I want to do is get that foot up a little bit and then challenge myself to get upright and then clench my butt a little bit and try to pull my tailbone under me just a little bit. So I don't even need to be that lengthened. I can be lowered just a little bit. This is going to naturally make my navel sort of shoot forward, and I'm just trying to counteract that. This clenching of the butt, clenching of the front is going to push my foot in there a little bit. So higher or lower with that box or chair, whatever you have, as you need, and then higher or lower with that sort of split squat. Turning it on, and then releasing slightly. Turning it on, releasing slightly. So I'm using these muscles, and I'm extending my hip flexors, hopefully causing warmth to happen in both of those. So there's a bunch of warm-up stuff you can do for your hips. So now that we are nice and warmed up, we've got the structure of the hip loosened up and warm, now is a perfect time to smash. So you could do this after your workout or after just doing some movement like that warm-up or some of those warm-ups. Each of these smashes you'd want to do for around 5 minutes per body area. So if we're looking at the quad on one side, hip flexor and quad, we would look at doing that for 5 minutes on one side and 5 minutes on the next. So the intensity with which you smash can be changed by the object you're using or how much pressure you're putting on. So you would want to be able to tolerate it for that 5 minutes. But you would not want it to be so light that you could tolerate it for 20 minutes and only do it for 5 minutes. So starting slow, figuring out how your body reacts, doing something that allows you to do it enough times in a week, long enough to actually make a difference. And I'd say if you're really working on one of these that seems to be doing you some favors, thinking about doing it 3 times a week for a month and then reassess how you're feeling would be a good goal. So that's 30 minutes a week for a month. It's not really that long of a time if it's going to help you get through something that is otherwise hindering you from living the life you want to live and using your body the way you want to use it. So first is smash, contract, relax, and floss with this hip flexor. I have a PVC here. You might have a wine bottle or a big kombucha bottle or a foam roller, or you have a smaller roller or a smaller bottle, but you can put your yoga mat over it a few times and turn it into something a little bit thicker and a little bit softer. So you probably have some combination of items that you can use to get some pressure on your quads. The goal is to go back and forth across your quad hip flexor area all the way up to pretty darn high. I like to do a once over first. So if I'm starting on one side, I might just go back and forth, and just sort of see where I'm feeling the tension the most. If you already know that your right hip bugs you, and that's why you're doing this, getting in this slightly outside line on that side might be a good place to start. Adding the contract relax here, I'll go to my other side just to make this a little bit easier to see. So let's say I went over the whole thing and I'm feeling, oh, like right there, just not on the exact top, but just outside. That's where your hip flexor comes all the way through your thigh. So that's where I might feel a little tight, and in fact I do. I'm going to contract that muscle, locking my knee, pressing my toe either into or towards the floor to get a really strong reaction or contraction on that muscle. Clenching my butt cheeks, all of that, tight, deep breath in. Hold for 4, 3, 2, 1, long slow exhale. As long and controlled of an exhale as you can, while you then release all that pressure and tension. Pressure stays on, the tension goes away. Then, to really take this to the next level, you can do a butt kicker over the roller. That's the floss part. From there, I might take a little break. I might move around a little bit, wiggle. I might come back to just above or just below that spot. Same thing. Contract. 4, 3, 2, 1. Long, slow exhale. Releasing that tension. And slow butt kicker. Taking the muscle and moving the muscle over the roller versus moving the roller around. Also just doing both at the same time, up and down, trying to get on both sides
But really that slightly tilted to one side is going to be the line of muscle that's generally going to affect the hip the most. So focusing on that for your hip stuff is going to be important. Once you get all the way up towards the hip socket itself or the hip joint itself, you might have to take yourself off of one edge so that you can allow the roller to get in there a little bit without smashing into your pubis and other pelvic structures. But same thing applies. You can still contract, you can still relax, and you can still hit that hip flexor if you would want to, or that butt kicker, I should say. All right, so there we go. Again, 5 minutes on one side, 5 minutes on another side, addressing this whole thigh and this hip flexor that comes down through there. Next, we've got some more specific glute stuff. Well, actually, let me come back to that. And let's talk a little bit about the psoas first. So the psoas is one of those deep abdominal hip flexors. It actually goes from the iliopsoas. We could just say it goes from the low back and the top of the pelvis down and connects to the top of the thigh bone. So it's somewhere around in here. And there's a bunch of different muscles, and it doesn't really matter if you know what muscle you're getting at as long as it's helpful. So if you have a ball of some sort, this lacrosse ball is probably the best. But if you had a baseball or even a golf ball, maybe a tennis ball, you could try it. It might be a little too squishy to get much of an effect. But I'm going to bend this leg, taking that psoas off tension. I'm going to find a spot that's just sort of like inside my obliques a little bit, between the ribs and the pelvis. I'm going to use something to load that up so that I don't have to just be pushing on it the whole time. You probably have something. And then just taking some breaths in, contracting against the ball, exhaling to release. If you feel visceral pain that is really not good, trust that feeling and do something else. But once we're here, we can try to slide that leg out. And if we feel that tension increase, we're probably on the psoas or one of those other deep abdominal hip flexors. We can sort of move around a little bit, go down a little bit, etc. And we can take this on and off. We can sort of rotate the foot in and out, windshield wiper style, and see if that sort of helps us get at something a little bit different or cause that movement. And we can slide the heel and knee up and out a few times as well. Really that breathing into the ball, to put pressure on the ball, forcing it out, and then exhale to release is probably going to be the thing you want to focus most on. And then just some searching around. Remember, bringing the knee up will take the pressure off that muscle. Sliding the heel out should put more pressure on it. And so that movement will help you sort of tune into where those muscles are and make sure you're on the structures you're trying to improve. Okay, and again, the psoas and stuff attach sort of in the back and come forward and attach down here as well. So again, I don't know, 5 minutes-ish on one side, 5 minutes-ish on the other side. All right, but getting into the glutes, then having your knees up will sort of give you the option of rolling side to side to put the ball where you want it. And then we can use the ball to just scrub all over the place. The thing we don't want to do is like let our spine get super weird when we're here. So shouldn't be too hard, and you should be able to sort of float around as you like while having the ball on your glutes. Target areas are anything here. We probably don't want to go right in the middle of the sacrum or tailbone. I don't know if that would feel good. So this top of the butt, side of the butt socket itself, and these glutes, anywhere you kind of want to play around with that is great. Also hitting this area right here by lying up on the side. For me, it's sort of where the pocket of my pants are, and I'm getting up here. That's the tensor fascia latae. I think I'm saying that right. TFL. And that contributes to hip stuff as well. And usually that gets pretty tight because there's not a great way to stretch that. So just spending some time you can push this knee down into the floor to sort of tense that, and then think about releasing that pressure. Push the knee in, release, and you can do that with breath as well. So all of this is fair game. Hunting out those tight spots, search and destroy. Again, just going over the whole area once real quick when you first get in there might be a good way to start and say, oh, okay, I felt something up in this region. I'm going to focus on that. Taking that knee out and in while you're loaded up, even pressing that knee out hard to contract the glutes, and then exhale, release that pressure. You could do some straightening and bending at the hip as well by sliding that heel out, sliding it in. 5 minutes-ish on one side, 5 minutes-ish on the other. Finally, we got some muscles in the back that kind of contribute to hip tightness, possibly the QL, possibly the erectors. We're not going to monkey around with being right on the spine, so we're out between an inch and maybe 6 inches, this whole area here from just outside the spine out towards the obliques. And it's best to do that with your feet either up on a wall or up on a box. That gives me the power to really lift my hips up as I need and gives me a lot more control. So same thing though, I'm going to sort of tilt to one side, getting the ball there, and then I'm going to just scrub back and forth across those massive lower back muscles, finding the spots that are the gnarliest, hanging out there, breathing into the ball. It's hard to do a contract relax super effectively with these low back muscles, so you might just be doing more static pressure and then this sort of rolling pressure across the muscles. 5 minutes one side, 5 minutes the other, somewhere in there, 3 to 7, let's say. You can't get a lot done in less than 3 minutes. By 7 minutes, probably you're hitting diminishing returns. And you could get out into the obliques and stuff. I don't know that those are specifically going to help hip function a whole lot, although they probably would. Probably all that gut smash and oblique smash would be helpful here as well. There's your smashes. So we've warmed, we've smashed. Next we'll show you some stretches. Let's complete the trilogy. Warm, check. Smash, check. Stretch. We're on stretch. Okay, so if you are having knee pain or hip pain combined with knee pain, or something of that nature where you think your knee and hip are sort of connected, maybe it's bleeding into your low back. Anyways, it's this sort of forward back stuff. Smashing your quad, smashing your thigh, doing that contractor relax and floss on your thigh, as well as making sure you're hitting this slightly off-center hip flexor rectus femoris line. Great. Warm that up, stretch that, or do some movement there, smash that. This is the other big piece of that. So if you do nothing else and that's kind of your main complaint, warm, smash, and then do the couch stretch. I guarantee you this will change your life in one way or another. It might just make you stronger emotionally. Anywho, the couch stretch. It's one of the best stretches that I can recommend generally to almost anybody. I have this here as a balance aid. Key is that I'm getting my knee in almost touching the wall. I just don't want it touching because I don't want my knee to be smashing into the wall once I get up here. Hip, knee, ankle are straight. My foot's more or less straight. I'm going to check that before I get too far into it. Just being here on your hands, one knee forward, one knee back, and trying to get your pelvis neutral. So some squeezing of the butt, some pressing down of the pelvis. That may be enough stretch. You're going to feel the stretch through the front of the hip and the thigh. If that's where you're at, great. Be there. Spend 2 minutes here, contracting, releasing. Awesome. Phase 2, getting your other foot out front. This puts considerably more pressure on that hip flexor. Again, same thing. Maybe you're hanging out here. Maybe you're taking that pressure off. Maybe you're putting that pressure more on, squeezing the glutes, contracting through the front of the body to help neutralize your pelvis and low back. This might be plenty of stretch for you. Again, just breathing into that stretch. Again, spend 2 minutes here. If that's where you're at, great. Pressure off, pressure on. Thinking about tipping the tailbone down and forward is going to increase that pressure. balance aid here, the more I can press myself back while keeping my low back and pelvis relatively neutral to each other, the more stretch this is putting on my hip flexor. Again, deep breaths, breathing into that area, take the pressure off a little bit, put it back on, squeeze the glute. I can press my foot into the wall, actually contracting these muscles. Deep breath in, press the foot into the wall, hold, 2, 1, long slow exhale. I release some of that pressure. The goal is to get pelvis and low back neutral, shoulders to the wall. I'm not there. I think a lot of people get there with that knee a little bit off the wall, and that's okay. Either way, our goal is to spend 2 minutes in this sort of relative discomfort, but it should be sort of a medium discomfort, especially if you're using that breathing, that contract relax. It's going to make it feel a little bit better. One side and then the other, 2 minutes-ish. Again, if you know that you're down here, or even that you're just starting this journey and you're here, just hanging out here and doing some of that squeezing of the glutes, pressing that hip down towards the floor, tucking your tailbone, that's going to be enough to start with. Great. Again, if you can warm up the hip, warm up the thigh, smash the thigh, and do this couch stretch for 2 minutes after that, a couple times a week, it's going to really change what's going on. Next up, seated twist. So seated, here we are seated. I'm going to get one foot back and cross this other foot over. You can see this is just sort of taking some of those low back and glute muscles on stretch. Most people sort of do this by cranking their elbow onto the other side. I would like you to think of it a little bit more of that you're trying to get your hips both sort of towards the floor, and then we're really lengthening up on an inhale, stretching up through the top of the head, and then as you exhale, thinking about just gently rotating. Trying to stretch all this stuff from the back of the thigh across here. Inhale up, exhale stretch. Great. You might think of that as like 10 breaths on each side. Next, even more glute focused, is going to be this figure 4. So I'm going to cross over, and then here's sort of the crux of this. I'm going to reach up, getting my shoulders off the ground. If I need to, I'm going to reach all the way through and get as much hand on that other shin as I need to. You might be here where you're just behind. That's great. Wherever you're at, you're going to attach, and then you're going to set your head and shoulders back down. Now you should be far enough in that actually pulls the tailbone up. So here I'm not quite getting it. I need to come through and grab a big handful of each hand on the other side. Then as I go back, that lifts the tailbone slightly. Now that that's lifted, I'm on pretty good stretch here. I'm going to take a deep breath in. Exhale, and as I exhale, I'm driving that tailbone down. So I'm really trying to activate my back. Really trying to push the tailbone back down towards the floor. Deep breath in again, relaxing. Exhale. Pressing that tailbone down. And I might hold the tailbone down and then take another deep breath in. Really filling my hips, breathing into the tightness, filling my abdomen. Fill, fill, fill. And then exhale. And maybe try to get a little bit deeper. Tailbone down. Now if I've made some progress, I might have to re-grip here to get my tailbone to come back up off the floor again. You might think, 10 breaths on one side, 10 breaths on the other, or you could roughly think 2 minutes on each side for that as well. Final stretch is going to be Happy Baby with some resistance. So Happy Baby is just reaching up and grabbing the bottoms of your feet and sort of pulling your hips wide, trying to get some amount of tailbone to come down as you pull your hips down, and then just some movement around side to side. We're trying to open up the inner thigh, hip stuff as well. So just noodling around there is great, but I'd actually like to take this to a little bit more like a frog stretch almost, and do some active resistance. So if I'm pushing open from the inside, I'm going to resist that, but I'm going to allow myself to open. And I might do that 5 times, where I actually use the strength of my arms to sort of stretch myself a little bit here while always resisting it. So you can go slowly, slowly, slowly towards that stretch, hang out in that stretch for a bit, and then come out of it. You might find this gets more tiring on your arms than anything. There we go. And then pressing from here, I'm going to actually push into that hand, pressing myself towards that stretch a bit. I think this active open close with the hips is more useful than just hanging out in a deep stretch. This one's probably going to be the best bang for your buck, where you're actually resisting that stretch while allowing it to happen. You're using the muscles that you're trying to lengthen throughout the stretch. If you could figure out some way to have bands pull your knees down, there are ways to do it. That would be another good way to achieve this. But even just light pressure with your hands, it doesn't have to be massive, should help. If you didn't like how that felt, you can always do a front stretch, which is just going to be knees out wide, and then I like to kind of take it back and forth to help open up, sort of like a wide-footed child's pose to whatever this sort of half plank thing is. So there you go. It's a bit of a kitchen sink of your hip. There's probably some stuff I'll think of later that I can add, but the basic formula is warm the muscles up, smash the muscles first to release some of that tension and adhesion, and then stretch, work on lengthening and trying to be active in those stretches, breathing, having good shapes, and using muscle activation to achieve your deeper stretches as you are able. There you go. Enjoy your fresh feeling hips.